Not every plane gets to enjoy a happy retirement after it reaches the point where it's no longer fit for purpose. Some of them are torn apart and used for scrap, but others simply get abandoned and left in places they really shouldn't be. In the process, they become unlikely landmarks, tourist attractions, or simply talking points among the local community. We've gathered some of the very best abandoned plane stories together for you in this video. The Bereev VVA-14 should have been an incredible achievement for the Soviet military. Had it worked properly, it would have been just as capable of taking off and landing at sea as it was at doing the same thing on land. The military hoped to use it for aerial battles, but also wanted it to be capable of battling submarines. Unfortunately, the project didn't pay off, because the mastermind behind it, famed Italian designer Robert Bartini, passed away before he could put the finishing touches on it. Nobody else was capable of taking over his work, and so the plan had to be abandoned. The VVA-14 was very nearly complete at the time of Bartini's death in 1974. It had been into the air several times and could land on the ground with no problem. There were just one or two slight issues with the pontoons, which were making sea landings difficult. Without Bartini, there was no way of overcoming the problem, and so the prototype is now parked forever in the Soviet Central Air Force Museum. The Pegasus might be an abandoned plane, but it's a celebrity of the abandoned plane world. Such its legend that an entire airfield in Antarctica is named after her. The C-121 Lockheed Constellation aircraft overshot the runway when it came in to land at McMurdo Station in 1970 and skidded off into a wall of ice and snow. Somehow the passengers and crew aboard the plane escaped with only minor injuries, but a combination of damage and practical difficulties meant that the plane was never salvaged. The underside of the plane was badly beaten up, and the landing gear was ripped clean off by the crash landing. It's been frozen in the ice ever since, and after half a century, it still looks like it arrived there yesterday. That's proof of the power of ice as a preservative. The stranded plane has become a landmark for other aircraft arriving at McMurdo, and the airfield around the wreck has been renamed Pegasus Airfield in honor of its permanent resident. If you know what this Boeing 737 is doing in a field close to a quarry in the south of Bali, please speak up. You'd be solving a big mystery if you did. No one has the slightest idea how this plane came to be here. It's not near an airport or any kind of runway, and it's a mere 5 minutes from the Pandawa beach. It's almost as if someone flew to the beach and decided not to come back and collect their plane after they were done. To add to the mystery, the plane is totally devoid of any identifying markings. It doesn't have livery or logos, and so nobody can say who it originally belonged to. Chances are it was a private plane, but people who own private planes don't tend to leave them lying around for years. None of the locals remember seeing it arrive, and nobody has ever come forth to claim it. There are rumors that a rich local businessman intended to have it converted into a restaurant, but if that's the case, they're taking their time following up on the idea. There's an element of farce about the wreckage of this Douglas DC-3, which crashed in February 1950. At the time of its crash, it was conducting a search and rescue mission for a DC-4, which had gone missing in the same area earlier in the same month. The DC-4 has still to this day never been found, and nor have any of the people who were aboard it when it went missing. But the story about the DC-3 has a happier ending. Everyone aboard it escaped with their lives, albeit with broken limbs in a few cases. It's thought that in an effort to see the ground more closely, the plane simply flew too low over the McClintock Mountains and got trapped by a downdraft, which the pilot couldn't overcome. If the incident happened a few months later, then the resulting crash would have been fatal. But fortunately, it had been snowing heavily that February. The Douglas came down onto a cushion of soft white snow that absorbed the worst of the impact and made survival possible. Unlike the crew of the DC-4 they were looking for, the DC-3 and its crew were found quickly. Our next story also concerns a Douglas DC-3, and this one's at the bottom of the ocean. There's no tale of misfortune this time, though. After the plane was retired from its cargo carrying duties in 2009, a Turkish dive center asked for permission to take ownership of it and turn it into an artificial reef. To their surprise, their request was granted, and the DC-3 was gently sunk into the water on July 1st that year. The operation was a total success. The plane wasn't damaged on the way down, and so it's still fully intact on the seabed. Since its sinking, it's developed a thick coating of algae, but it's doing its job perfectly. As well as serving a practical purpose, the plane is a major attraction to divers. The doors of the Douglas, which is known as the Dakota, have deliberately been left open so divers can gain access to it if they so wish. Getting into the cockpit isn't easy, but it can be done, and people have taken pictures and video to prove they did it. The Namc Ys11 planes that were once built in Japan have a poor reputation among aviation enthusiasts. They have a reputation for crashing, with 20 of the 182 units completed suffering fatal accidents. Unsurprisingly, the model was discontinued as the accident count went up. It wasn't an accident that put this Ys11 into the jungle of Curaçao, though. This is another attempt at turning a plane into a restaurant that was abandoned before completion. Once upon a time, this was Air Aruba Flight P4YSA. You'll have to forgive it for not looking its best. Plants and trees are growing around and through it, and the forest is in the process of claiming it piece by piece. You can climb in and take a look around if you wish, but you should exercise caution when doing so. Previous explorers have reported that the interior of the forgotten plane is full of wasp nests. Nobody knows specifically who brought the plane to Curaçao, but it would have happened sometime after the year 2000, which is when Air Aruba went bankrupt and sold off all their vehicles. There's a plane at the El Alamein Military Museum in Egypt that has quite a story behind it. And it's a story that the British don't like to hear. Although it's been restored and repainted, the British RAF Kitty Hawk was found as a wreck in the Sahara Desert in 2012, where it had been since being shot down during the Second World War. The desert had preserved the wreck well, with the bulk of the Kitty Hawk still being intact. The damage from the crash was only light, and the British wanted to restore it and turn it into a museum piece. The Egyptians agreed, but they wanted it for their own museum, rather than handing it over to the British. To make matters worse, the restoration work they've performed upon it is inaccurate. The original plane never had shark's teeth painted on the front as it does now, and fiberglass was used to patch up the holes in the plane's canvas body, which is also inauthentic. It's a one-of-a-kind exhibit, but it's not supposed to look like this. The sad reality about many of the planes that were lost or shot down during the Second World War is that they'll never be discovered. But some of them do still turn up from time to time, and they're often in unlikely places. Nico Bay in Palau, Micronesia is a popular tourist destination, but somehow nobody noticed the massive Japanese warplane standing in shallow water until 2017. The plane, which still has its wings attached, is an Aichi E-13A, a model which was used extensively for reconnaissance during the war. You can take a canoe and row directly over the top of it if you desire. Planes like this one don't turn up often, and even this isn't a perfect example. It's upside down in the water, which means many of its more easily identifiable markings can't be seen. A little gruesomely, the fact that it's upside down means that we can't say for sure whether or not the unfortunate pilot might still be there, strapped to his chair in a watery grave. Perhaps some things are better left undisturbed. What makes the wreck of the Keybird in Greenland so unusual is that it's been wrecked not just once, but twice. The B-29 Superfortress bomber was on a Cold War spying mission when it was forced to make an emergency landing after running low on fuel. The crew was evacuated 3 days later, but Keybird was left where she stood and stayed there alone for almost half a century. Then, in 1994, a rescue mission turned up to repair the old plane and finally fly her home. Everything went as planned during the initial stages of the repair work, but disaster struck after everyone thought the work was done. As Keybird powered up and began to taxi to a takeoff position, the rear fuselage caught fire. The crew ran for their lives and successfully escaped, but the fire completely destroyed the plane. What's left of it has subsequently sunk to the bottom of a lake. Nobody's ever going to attempt to rescue her again, and so that's where she'll stay. What's an Ilyushin Il-76 cargo plane from the 1970s doing standing in the baking heat of Al-Quwain in the United Arab Emirates? It was built in Uzbekistan. The answer to that question lies in the fact that it's had some fairly questionable owners over the years. After being retired from Soviet military service in 1990, the plane was sold to a small airline called Air Ses, which happened to be run by the brother of Victor Bout. You may have heard Bout's name on the news. He's one of the world's most notorious illegal arms dealers. Air Ses was charged with more than 100 violations of civil aviation law in 1998 and disbanded in 2001. Both of the Bout brothers were subsequently banned from entering the UAE, meaning they haven't been able to reclaim the plane. It's technically still Bout's brother's property, but he has no means of collecting it or having it removed. It's seemingly doomed to stand baking on this boiling hot runway for all eternity. The plane known as Lady Be Good was arguably the most famous of all the B-24D Liberator planes in the service of the United States military during the Second World War, which made her sudden disappearance in 1943 all the more upsetting when it happened. The plane had set off from a Libyan airbase to attack Italian targets but failed to make it back home again. The weather was poor on that April day, and the pilot had already radioed into base to call off the bombing mission because he couldn't see the target through the rain and fog. His next radio message said that the navigation systems had failed and he was flying blind. That's the last anyone saw or heard of Lady Be Good until 1958, when some oil prospectors, looking for a good digging site, found her by accident in the Libyan desert, more than 300 miles from the base. There was no sign of the crew, and the parachutes were gone, which makes it likely she crashed into the sand with nobody at the controls. Swamp Ghost might not be the best-looking B-17 Flying Fortress you've ever seen, but cut her some slack. She spent nearly 7 whole decades trapped in a swamp in Papua New Guinea, which is how she got her nickname. Captain Frederick Eaton was the pilot on the day she went down in 1942. She took damage in an aerial duel, and the swamp was the best option open to Eaton for an emergency landing. Amazingly, he escaped with his life and made his way back through the terrain, but couldn't report the exact location of the crash. It wasn't until 1972 that a helicopter spotted the old plane from overhead by chance, and 34 years after that, when a salvage mission was finally attempted, finally in 2010, an American rescue team pulled her out of the swamp and cleaned her up. She now has a pride of place at the Pacific Aviation Museum in Pearl Harbor, and we think she's earned her retirement. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!